And we are seeing ICE presence here in Northeast Florida this week.
Right. Agents were spotted running joint operations with FHP throughout our area.
Florida, they're trying to get their hands on your money.
Yeah, so the FBI is warning, don't fall for it. As News4Jax reporter Aaron Farrar tells us, these scammers are using threats.
Extract from Joint Command Log 18. Read. At 5:21 a.m., January 28, 2026, Entry Team Alpha breached Bay 4 of the North Star Transit Warehouse off Barge Channel Road in St. Paul, Minnesota. Ambient conditions were normal. Exterior cameras active. Snow drift at loading lane. No sign at first glance that the building held anything more dangerous than freight paperwork and winter tires. Then the inner partition came down. Behind a row of shrink-wrap pallets sat a caged office with bunk frames, thermal blankets, pediatric cough syrup, prepaid phones, and laminated route cards clipped to a whiteboard. One board listed bus departures, another listed intake numbers, a third carried abbreviations for county jails, motel names, and transfer windows across Minnesota, the Dakotas, Wisconsin, Iowa, Nebraska, and Illinois. On a metal desk, agents recovered wristbands, intake envelopes, and a lockbox containing $842,000 in cash, 22 foreign passports, and a spreadsheet titled Cleared Loads. The building had been registered as a logistics support hub for regional passenger carriers. It also functioned as a sorting point for a human smuggling shield that hid inside legitimate transport flow. Men, women, and children had been moved through buses, warehouse vans, service corridors, and detention-linked holding sites under paperwork designed to make the movement look administrative. That was the first rupture. The second was worse. Several access sheets carried contact codes matching county transport contractors, a private facility, compliance manager, and a former booking sergeant in southern Minnesota. This was not just a smuggling route touching the state. On it was an infrastructure corridor protected by people who understood exactly how to make mass movement disappear into routine operations. Hold that image. A freight bay in winter, a federal breach, a wall that should not have been there, because once the FBI pulled the first digital records from Bay 4, Minnesota stopped looking like a waypoint. It started looking like the Shield. The case began with a roadside stop that should have ended as a citation. On June 6, 2025, a Minnesota State Patrol trooper stopped a white shuttle bus on Interstate 94 near Alexandria for a defective brake light and an obscured carrier decal. The driver, Thomas Weller, produced a transport manifest describing the passengers as seasonal labor transfers headed west. The paperwork was neat. The seating was not. 43 people were packed inside, including 9 juveniles, several carrying identical brown envelopes stamped with intake numbers instead of names. When troopers separated the group, the story fractured immediately. 2 passengers said they had crossed from Manitoba into Minnesota through an unmonitored wooded approach near Lake of the Woods and were told they were being taken to processing. Others believed they were headed to jobs in meatpacking, roofing, or custodial work. One 17-year-old from Guatemala carried a wristband from a motel in Moorhead, not a labor center. Another passenger had a booking slip from a county-linked holding site, despite no criminal record and no formal release documentation. That mismatch triggered a referral to the FBI and Homeland Security investigations. Within 10 days, analysts found the same carrier code from Weller's bus tied to motel blocks in Bloomington, warehouse leases in St. Paul, and transport invoices from a company called North Reach Mobility Services. Treasury flagged fast-cycle payments moving through freight brokers, staffing shells, and migrant relocation support vendors. The money was too disciplined to be improvised. The manifests were too standardized to be local. Then a second clue surfaced. Surveillance images from a bus hub in Mankato showed passengers leaving through a service door, not the public terminal, then boarding vans marked for medical supply delivery. The stop had exposed a route, the cameras exposed a method, and once federal investigators overlaid vehicle data with detention transfers, shelter placements, and contractor billing, 9 interstate trafficking corridors began to resolve across the upper Midwest. The first weeks of mapping turned one suspicious bus line into a systems case. Agents built the corridor model from the outside in. Public-facing nodes came first: ticket counters in St. Paul, bus yards in Minneapolis, motel clusters in Bloomington and Burnsville, farm labor pickup lots near Worthington, warehouse leases in Moorhead, St. Cloud, and Duluth. Then came the shadow layer: service entrances, after-hours holding rooms, subcontracted van fleets, county-linked transport invoices, motel reservations paid in blocks under rotating corporate names. By August, the task force had identified 52 transport hubs worth investigation. Not all were criminal, but enough carried recurring anomalies to show pattern. Identical passenger groups moving under different manifests, minors listed as adults, duplicate emergency contacts, and late-night transfers coinciding with detention releases or private relocation orders that could not be fully documented. The financial trail explained how the shield held together. North Reach Mobility Services billed transport support. Iron Valley Staffing billed intake coordination. Prairie Lantern Outreach posed as a humanitarian relocation nonprofit. Great Lakes Compliance Group handled detention-adjacent consulting. Each entity touched another through proxy ownership, common bookkeepers, or shared payment processors. Treasury later tied the wider network to $120 million in illicit logistics activity, including smuggling fees, labor kickbacks, forged placement contracts, facility payments, and interstate transfer laundering. Then the corruption layer opened. A former booking sergeant in Freeborn County pushed undocumented release windows to trusted drivers. A private compliance officer attached to a detention-linked inspection vendor pre-cleared facilities before scheduled reviews. 2 motel managers in Bloomington kept side ledgers matching intake numbers to room rotations. A county transport subcontractor moved people on paper as medical transfers, then diverted them to labor brokers or shield properties before dawn. Watch the progression. A traffic stop became a route map. The route map became a business structure. The business structure became a protection system. And the more investigators pulled records, the less this resembled chaos at the edge of the border. And it resembled a disciplined corridor running through Minnesota under cover of freight, detention, and relocation paperwork. The mechanism worked because every layer borrowed legitimacy from a different institution. A smuggled family or solo traveler might cross into northern Minnesota through a wooded approach, arrive at a cabin or short-stay property near International Falls, then be moved south in stages. First a van, then a shuttle bus, then a motel, then a warehouse holding room. If enforcement pressure rose, the same person could be relabeled as a shelter transfer, a labor placement, or a detention-linked medical movement depending on which contractor had the cleaner paperwork. What looked like administration was actually concealment. The network relied on route redundancy. If Interstate 35 grew hot, our traffic shifted west to Fargo-Moorhead and down I-94. If public terminals drew scrutiny, drivers used warehouse docks and service alleys. If shelters required verification, corrupt intermediaries generated intake packets through outreach shells or private vendors. Children traveled with adults they had met only hours earlier. Men seeking jobs were bundled with families to reduce suspicion. Women were steered toward safe hotels that doubled as recruitment pools for labor exploitation farther south. Digital control kept the machine synchronized. Group chats issued lane changes in real time. QR-coded wristbands matched intake numbers to transport windows. Drivers received rotating instructions from admin accounts that vanished every 72 hours. That one seized phone later showed how a simple color system governed movement. Blue for shelter handoff, yellow for labor handoff, red for detention-linked diversion, black for emergency concealment. This was not a riot of smugglers improvising at the roadside. It was a logistics network embedded in ordinary Midwestern infrastructure: bus depots, motel chains, county vans, compliance vendors, freight yards, highway service corridors. Each piece alone looked mundane. Together, they created a human smuggling shield, strong enough to move thousands and confuse the line between custody, transit, and exploitation. The operational core centered on 4 people: Calvin Rourke, 48, owned North Reach Mobility Services and understood movement better than ideology. He knew which terminals looked understaffed, in which warehouse docks were ignored by inspectors, and which county contracts provided the cleanest paper cover for dirty transfers. According to the indictment, he treated people like reroutable cargo. Marisol Vega, 39, ran Prairie Lantern Outreach, the nonprofit face of the corridor. Publicly, she appeared in donor newsletters beside winter coat drives and relocation language. Privately, prosecutors allege she controlled intake lists, sponsor fraud packets, and emergency housing assignments that fed victims into the shield. Darren Pike, 55, was the insider bridge. A former booking sergeant, Pike no longer wore a badge, but he understood release timing, transport logs, and detention procedure well enough to exploit every blind corner. He was the reason people could leave one facility on paper and vanish into another system in practice. At the fourth node was not a gangster. It was Angela Sorensen, 44, a regional compliance manager for a detention-linked inspection contractor. Sorensen's signature appeared on site reviews at multiple facilities, later found to have holding irregularities, unauthorized room use, and manipulated intake files. None of them needed dramatic threats in every case. Procedure did the coercion for them. Cold weather did the coercion. Language barriers did the coercion. Fear of removal did the coercion. That was the shield. Operation Winter Lantern began at 4:40 a.m. on January 28th from command posts in St. Paul, Bloomington, Duluth, and Moorhead. FBI Minneapolis led the action with HSY, IRSCI, Minnesota State Patrol, County Task Force officers, and victim service teams assigned directly to search and rescue elements. 18 coordinated enforcement raids had been synchronized against transport yards, warehouse suites, motel blocks, records offices, contractor residences, and detention-linked facilities under federal warrant authority. The first wave hit the records. At 4:52, digital teams entered North Reach Mobility's dispatch office near Como Avenue and cloned root servers before remote wipe commands could hit. At 5:03, Treasury served seizure notices on payment processors and shell accounts tied to $120 million in illicit logistics flows. At 5:11, warrant teams reached 2 Bloomington motels where room ledgers had been cross-referenced with intake numbers from northern pickup sites. One manager tried to destroy notebooks in a laundry bin. Another had already texted a warning to a driver moving south on II-35. Then the tempo changed. At 5:21, a Bay 4 in St. Paul was breached. At 5:28, a holding annex behind a bus repair yard in Mankato was opened. At 5:34, teams entered 3 warehouse-linked transfer rooms in Moorhead. At 5:41, agents and inspectors began simultaneous inspection actions at 27 detention-linked facilities and contracted holding sites across Minnesota. Some sites were compliant, some were chaotic. Some carried records so incomplete that task force officers had to reconstruct who had slept there from meal logs, camera fragments, and discarded wristbands. The first operational picture suggested a major win. Drivers were in custody, hubs were locked down, servers were seized. But that was only the beginning. Live exploitation from a dispatch laptop recovered in St. Paul revealed active reroute orders already pushing loads toward Wisconsin and Iowa. Federal teams shifted mid-operation. Highway interdiction units were redeployed. Air support tracked 2 vans leaving Albert Lee under a medical transport credential. Both were stopped before the state line. In one, officers found children wrapped in winter blankets beside intake folders for a shelter that had no record of them. By nightfall, the scope of the crackdown was clear. More than 3,400 individuals had been detained, screened, or segregated during enforcement actions, transport interceptions, facility inspections, and coordinated identity checks. Not all were criminal defendants. Many were potential victims, material witnesses, fraudulent sponsors, transport facilitators, or individuals held for status verification and protective processing. That distinction mattered. So did the numbers: 18 raids, and 52 hubs investigated, 9 interstate routes disrupted, 640 digital records seized, A corridor that had hidden in ordinary movement was no longer invisible. The evidence catalog was operational, not theatrical. Agents recovered 640-plus digital records, including route dashboards, intake spreadsheets, wristband data, sponsor fraud templates, motel room rotations, transport manifests, and payment matrices assigning value to labor handoffs and shield transfers. They seized 71 phones, 16 laptops, 11 portable drives, and 4 handwritten ledgers that translated the color code used across the corridor. Financial tracing confirmed shell payments tied to Northreach Mobility, Prairie Lantern Outreach, Iron Valley Staffing, and Great Lakes Compliance Group. Prosecutors later described the scheme as a hybrid network, part smuggling corridor, part labor pipeline, part detention evasion shield. The $120 million figure reflected not cash stacked in one room, but the total value of movement fees, contractor fraud, false placements, reroute payments, and downstream exploitation linked to the corridor. The most damaging records were the ordinary ones: meal counts, linen deliveries, bus refueling logs, site inspection signatures. The network had survived because routine systems kept generating paperwork sturdy enough to hide abuse in plain view. Luis Herrera, 16, told agents he had stopped asking where he was after the third transfer. Every place looked temporary. A motel room, a bus seat, a caged office, a county van. And he said the worst moment came when one driver told him not to worry because this is official now. And Luis believed him. Nadia Osman, a 29-year-old asylum seeker traveling with her 6-year-old daughter, was moved through 3 locations in 2 days under promises of shelter placement. Instead, she was routed into a contractor-linked room where no one could explain which agency, if any, was responsible for her. By the time victim teams reached her, she had started keeping her child awake at night so they would not be separated during a transfer. The human cost in Minnesota was not only the smuggling itself, it was the conversion of legitimate-looking transit, custody, and aid systems into instruments of uncertainty. Once that happens, even a real bus, a real clinic, or a real shelter can feel like part of the trap. In the months that followed, federal prosecutors filed conspiracy, human smuggling, transportation for exploitation, document fraud, money laundering, wire fraud, harboring, obstruction, and civil rights-related charges against the principal defendants and multiple secondary facilitators. State reviews were opened into county transport subcontracting, detention inspection protocols, and contractor credentialing. Several facilities lost certification. 2 counties suspended outside movement contracts pending audit. Public briefings emphasized rescue, verification, and oversight reform. Those measures were necessary. They were not final, because the deeper lesson was structural. Minnesota's crackdown did not uncover a single rogue convoy moving through snow. It uncovered a shield built from overlap, border anxiety, contractor sprawl, transport outsourcing, overloaded shelters, fragmented detention records, and a highway network dense enough to blur custody with transit. When those systems stop speaking clearly to one another, criminal operators do not need to defeat the state. They only need to learn its paperwork better than the people supervising it. That is why the case should be read as more than a border story. It was an infrastructure warning. The exploited corridor ran through bus terminals, storage bays, motel chains, inspection vendors, labor recruiters, county release windows, and winter emergency housing. Each institution had a legitimate role. Each offered camouflage. Once linked together by corrupt facilitators, they created a human smuggling shield large enough to absorb pressure and still keep moving south, east, or west. And the official numbers give the operation its outline. More than 3,400 individuals detained, screened, or held during enforcement phases. 18 coordinated raids. 52 transport hubs investigated. 9 interstate trafficking routes disrupted. 27 detention-linked facilities inspected. More than 640 digital records seized. $120 million in illicit logistics networks dismantled. Those metrics describe an enforcement victory. They do not guarantee the blueprint is gone. On one seized drive labeled Weather Contingencies, investigators found draft route proposals extending through northern Wisconsin and into secondary hubs outside Minnesota if enforcement tightened. Another file proposed new partnerships with transport vendors not yet charged. The architecture was adaptable by design. Pressure one lane and another opens. Close one warehouse and a motel corridor picks up the flow. Remove one corrupt contractor and a compliance shell appears to replace it. So the final warning is plain. The danger was never just the people inside Bay 4. It was the ease with which ordinary systems can be taught to carry extraordinary abuse. When movement, custody, labor, and aid begin sharing dirty intermediaries, a state does not need a formal cartel presence to become a trafficking corridor. It only needs enough blind spots, enough paperwork, and enough people willing to confuse process with legitimacy. Minnesota exposed the shield. The question now is whether the systems that enabled it will stay lit once the cameras leave.